Tash Delay, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by Asia Freedom Institute, a non-profit organization that calls for democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Butt, and I'm the moderator for today's topic on Tibet, Mongolia, and the Dalai Lama, a special and centuries old relationship. I'm sure today's discussion is going to be a really interesting one because we will be diving into the fascinating and the unique bond between Tibet and Mongolia, a relationship that dates back to the 13th century and why they still remain significant even today. It's my honor to introduce you to Dr. Uradin Bulag, historical and political anthropologist at the University of Cambridge, Telatulku Rinpoche, honorary representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Mongolia, Russia, and CIS countries, Dr. Lakwa Demchik Jadampa, Anthropology and Archaeology Department at National University of Mongolia. A very warm welcome, dear panelists, to AFI's Freedom Hour discussion. And I keep shortening the bio of our speakers because I want to save more time for the discussion. But I request our viewers that if you want to get the full bio of our speakers, you can always go to Asia Freedom Institute's website. And the agenda for today's discussion is, initially we will be starting off with two general questions intended to all our speakers, followed by two rounds of individual questions. If we have time at the end, we have one general question that will be intended to all our speakers, and all our speakers will have 3 minutes to give your answers. And I request our speakers to please stay within the time limit so that we don't exceed our discussion way too long. So without further ado, I would first like to start with Dr. Bulag, followed by Rinpoche and Dr. Jadamba. So the first question is really important because it is one of the claims that the Chinese government they keep making is regarding Tibet being a part of China, that China had inherited authority over Tibet from the Yuan Empire. So, what are your views on this claim, and how does this assertion align or conflict with historical records and the nature of Mongol-Tibet relations during the Yuan dynasty? And as mentioned earlier, that the relation between Tibet and Mongol were very special and unique. So, walk us through the unique aspects of the Mongol-Tibet relations pre, during, and post-Yuan period. Dr. Bulag, we'll start with you. Sorry, Dr. Bulag, you were on mute.
Very much for inviting me to this discussion. Now, the question you raised is a very complicated one, and at the same time, I acknowledge it's also a very sensitive one. And I think it requires us to disentangle several critical issues, I think. So first of all, it is unquestionable that the Yuan dynasty was a state funded by the Mongols. Right? Nobody can dispute that. Now, the Yuan dynasty was the nominal center of the Mongol Empire, right, which includes several Khanates, and as some of the audience probably know, that the Golden Horde, right, and often Wars, they're ruling over today's Kazakhstan and Russia, well, maybe not all of Russia, but it's the greater part of Russia. And then we have the Ilkhanate, that is, that rules the region that is now Iran and Iraq, and the Chagatai Khanate, which controlled areas including today's Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, that part of the region roughly. Now, a question arises here, that is, who are really the legitimate successors to these states or Khanates or dynasties? Now, as far as the Yuan dynasty concerned, China never actually claimed, or Chinese, shall we say, Chinese people never actually claimed that the Yuan dynasty had their legitimate state in the way it does today, right? Instead, the Yuan was always viewed as an alien, barbaric state or regime, rather than as a state established by an ethnic minority, right, devoted to China, right, as some contemporary Chinese scholars and politicians claim. Now, it is important to know, I think, that the Chinese rebels who overthrew the Yuan dynasty did so not only under the banner of anti-corruption. They say the Mongols were corrupt, right? So they need to got rid of the Mongolians, but also through what might be called or described as a racist or racialist slogan. In Chinese, it's called "驱逐胡虏,恢复中华," that is, drive out or expel the barbarian and restore China to the Chinese. Now, this term, 中华, right, 中华, 驱逐中华, as 驱逐胡虏,恢复中华, 中华, now it is actually an overarching term for the Chinese state, 中华人民共和国, the People's Republic of China, and the newly conceptualized Chinese nation, 中华民族. It was actually originally used in opposition to the Mongols, right? So they overthrew the Mongols, drive out the Mongols to restore China, 中华, to the Chinese. Now, a similar slogan was raised and resurfaced during the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen against the Manchu-founded Qing dynasty. Now, the direct successors of the of the Yuan dynasty or Yuan state were really indeed the Mongols themselves, right? After being driven out of China, they constituted a smaller Yuan state and attempted repeatedly to reconquer their lost territories. And the Chinese Ming dynasty built the Great Walls to stop the Chinese invasion. So the Great Wall of China, you see, in Beijing, near Beijing, when you visit Beijing, and those were the walls built against the Mongols. Now, the Mongols maintained Yuan as their state name until they were eventually conquered by the Manchus in the 17th century. So there was no doubt that the Mongols were really the successor to the Yuan state. Now, the issue of succession to the Yuan state or to the Mongol Empire is really a politically sensitive topic, and I believe it is really counterproductive for any one state today to monopolize the legacy of the Yuan or the Mongol Empire. Instead, I suggest that this heritage or legacy should really be shared by all the states whose territories were once under Yuan or Mongol control. So if you ask me for my personal view, right, then my view is that the Chinese claim to Tibet in the name of the Mongol Yuan is dubious at best. And it is also worth noting that in recent years, I have to say that the narrative that Tibet has been part of China since the Yuan dynasty has been downplayed in China. So instead, the Chinese claim now is that Tibet has been part of China since time immemorial. 自古以来, that's the Chinese term. That is a statement that I believe it is equally dubious, right? So can you imagine that, a country or a place has been a part of, another country from time immemorial? That's nonsense. But nonetheless, this narrative, I believe, has spared the Mongols, for which I'm really grateful. Now, I'm also aware that Tibetans often invoke a special Mongol-Tibetan relationship to counter Chinese claims, right? And they do so by suggesting a unique hierarchy, right, the Mongols ruled China and the Chinese, well, the Tibetans were spiritual leaders or teachers of the Mongols, right? They make that claim. And it is really intriguing that in this claim or narrative, the Mongols are depicted merely as promoters of Tibetan Buddhism, much like the Chinese claim that the Mongols conquered the world out of love for China. Uh, Now, while such assertions may be, I think, psychologically comforting, they really obscure political realities and do little to address the challenges we face today. Now, an interesting question now is whether the Mongols in Mongolia today, can or have the aptitude to resolve this entanglement, right? We have this three-party entanglement, right? The Chinese, Tibetans, and the Mongols. And that entanglement was created by the ancestors of today's Mongols in the first place. So the question is really, can the Mongols today serve as mediators between China and Tibet? If so, how? Now, this might seem like a quixotic, proposition, right? Given that, today Mongolia doesn't really hold the same power as it once did. But nonetheless, I think it is a suggestion probably worth considering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balag, for your thoughtful and detailed response. Rinpoche, let's hear your perspective on this. Rinpoche, you'll have to unmute first.
Sorry about that. Yeah, is more of my opinion is more of the contemporary status and the relationship between the Tibet and the Mongolian people. Of course, I'm very interested to create a better understanding of the Mongol-Tibet relations in the 20th century. Of course, there's a sufficient information and historical materials of Mongol-Tibet relation of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, but there is very limited knowledge or understanding and very limited research and study that has been done regarding the Mongol-Tibet relation in the 20th century. Luckily, we have been able to reestablish and revive these historical ties in the late 20th century from the 1990s onwards after Mongolia became a democratic state. So I think it is very important for us to focus on how we disconnected in the of the 20th century. And it's very important for us to know of each other's tragedies, how much we suffered under communism, and how much Tibet continues to suffer under the communist rule. Fortunately and unfortunately, at the same time, Mongolia was very fortunate enough to become a democratic state in 1990 and 1991 onwards. Big changes happened, but unfortunately, our what we call our twin brothers and sisters, which is Tibetan people, continue to suffer under the occupation of China. So I think as an independent nation, Mongolia definitely has a moral responsibility to support the cause of Tibet and the issues of Tibet. But at the same time, we have very limited knowledge about what is happening in Tibet. So I, as a representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration, that is one of my tasks, is to create awareness and educate the people on all levels, whether it's government officials, whether it's university scholars and historians, journalists, and the general public, to educate them about the current situation of Tibet. So it's a very challenging task, but an important task. At the same time, it's a very delicate issue, but yet it is very exciting once the people know the facts and the historical ties.
Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for pointing out this really important note about creating awareness. Totally agree with you on that. Dr. Jadamba, let's hear your perspective on this.
Good afternoon and good morning. Regarding Chinese claim on Tibet during the Mongol-Yuan period, my view is China was a part of the Mongol Empire. It was ruled by Mongol Khans, and Tibet was also under the Mongol domain. So since both China and Tibet were subjects of the Mongol Empire, is it accurate to assert that Tibet was a part of China during the Yuan period? If the assertion is true, it can lead a similar argument that India could claim that Sri Lanka has been a part of India since the British rule over India. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much Thank you so much to all the speakers. Your insights have provided an understanding of the unique nature of Mongol-Tibet relationship. And now moving on to the next question. Let's now focus on the role of the Dalai Lama, who has been a central figure in Mongol-Tibet relations. So could you briefly describe the significance of the Dalai Lama and how his institution has contributed to the historical and ongoing connections between Mongolia and Tibet? Dr. Bulag, will start with you again.
All right, thank you. It's again a complicated question and it would require a lengthy answer, but let me make it short. I think, first of all, it is crucial to place the relationship between Mongolia and Tibet in historical context. And I think the institution of the Dalai Lama emerged as a product of Mongol-Tibetan collaboration, right, during a period of profound political crisis in both Mongolia and Tibet in the 16th century. That is a time when the Mongols were mired in internal conflict, right, civil wars, princes are fighting each other, killing each other, and Tibetans were similarly embroiled in sectarian struggles in the religious arena. So this institution, the Dalai Lama institution, in my view, brought about significant transformations in the political landscapes, right, of both Mongolia and Tibet. And I think it resulted in the establishment of a unified polity known as, in Mongolian, Hayur Yoson, or dual principle, right, whereby the state and religion, are supposed to mutually support each other. Now, I think as a result of this alliance, the traditional institution of there's some negative aspect, I believe, or depends on your perspective. That is the traditional institution of the Tibetan kingship, right, collapsed, with the Mongols assuming the role of Tibetan rulers, while, upholding the Gelugpa Buddhism, represented by two institutions of the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. So in other words, both these religious institutions became really heavily dependent on Mongol support for their survival, right? And the Mongol influence was really so pronounced that the fourth Dalai Lama, or rather the actual second Dalai Lama, in historical terms, was himself a Mongol, right? So that's a historical fact. We should recognize that. Now, nonetheless, this alliance, or I put it this way, this reliance on Mongol military support proved to be both advantageous and detrimental to the Tibetans, just as the use of religion for legitimacy was for the Mongols. So, since the 16th century, Tibetan polity has been vulnerable to external intervention. Basically, I'm saying, Mongol and later Manchu, and then, the British and then the Chinese. And as the successive Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas have often sought the backing of foreign powers. Now, conversely, I think the Mongol adoption of Tibetan Buddhism and the establishment of the dual principle of state and Buddhism supporting each other ultimately undermine the traditional Mongolian political legitimacy, which has been based solely on the lineage of Genghis Khan, right? Now, this shift, I think, fragmented the unity of the Mongol polity, leading to the emergence of multiple principalities, often fighting each other. And in many cases, interestingly, right, these principalities obtained their Hanli titles from the Dalai Lama, effectively making the Dalai Lama the kingmaker among the Mongolians. Now, we know the Manchu subjugated the Mongols and Tibetans in the 17th century, right? And since then, the Qing dynasty reinforced Tibetan domination over the Mongols. That's also interesting, right? And that's a point that is missed by many people. Now, notably, the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, the spiritual leader of the Khalkha Mongols, was required to be reincarnated from Tibet, right, following the passing of the second reincarnation. Yeah, maybe I should stop here and allow Rinpoche and Sabdinchik to elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bulag, and thank you for bringing the topic on Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, and we will talk more about that in our later discussions. Rinpoche, let's hear your perspective. Rinpoche, your mic, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Same question or different? Same question. Yeah. So I think the symbolic status of the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu is not only important for the Mongolian people, but it is also very important for Tibet as well. And historically, we shared a very a guru and disciple relationship for many centuries. There has been many wonderful Tibetan Buddhist masters who have many followers and disciples that are Mongolian. And also at the same time, there is many famous Mongolian lamas and well-learned scholars who had many students and followers among the Tibetans for many centuries. So the reincarnation system is not only something that belongs to the Tibetan people, but I think that is something nowadays that has become very universal. If you look at the independent nations such as Bhutan, India, and also Mongolia, in these sovereign independent nations, we have many reincarnated lamas that are follower of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So the importance of the Jebtsundamba is not only important for the Tibet for the Mongolian people, but it is also very important for the Tibetan people as well. But at the same time, the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, if you can say respectfully, that it is almost like an equal status of His Holiness to the Dalai Lama, of how the Dalai Lama was for the Tibetan people. He was the spiritual and the temporal leader of the Tibetan people. Similarly, the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu was the political and the spiritual leader of the Mongolian people as well. Back in 2011, as we all know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has given up his political role and remains as a spiritual leader. Similarly, the new reincarnation, or the 10th reincarnation of the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, who was identified and recognized by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in 2016, is the spiritual leader of Mongolia and will be the spiritual leader of Mongolia. Though we have our own government, president, prime minister, and so on, but nevertheless, the Jebtsundamba will remain as the spiritual leader and the spiritual figure, and a symbolic role to play, because the status of the reincarnation symbolizes Mongolia's rich heritage. When I say rich, it symbolizes the rich heritage. It's not just the Buddhist heritage, but it is the Mongolia's heritage and history as well. And also, it symbolizes the independence of Mongolia as a nation.
Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for shedding light more on Jebtsundamba Khutuktu. Let's hear Dr. Chandaba's perspective on how significant is the role of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is in Mongolia, and how has his institution contributed to the historical and the ongoing connections between Mongolia and Tibet. Dr. Jadamba, the screen is yours.
Regarding the Dalai Lama institution, the religious political alliances between the Mongol Hans and Tibetan Lamas over the periods of time intensified the creation of a culture of the man, which we may call the Tibetan-Mongolian Buddhist culture zone. So this culture zone covers vast territories, as we know, ranging from the Himalayas to Siberia, and was characterized by the spread of Tibetan-Mongolian Buddhism and its associated cultural practices. So notably, within this expansive region, the dominance and impact of a Gelug school and the institution of the Dalai Lama, as well as the institution of Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, have been undeniably significant. Particularly in the Mongolian culture areas. Inner Mongolia, 3 Buddhist republics of the Russian Federation, and the sovereign state of Mongolia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jadamba. We've spoken about the importance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also we've spoken about another pivotal spiritual figure in Mongolia, which is Jebtsundamba Khutuktu. So now my question to Dr. Bulag is that in March 2023, like Rinpoche mentioned, His Holiness the Dalai Lama publicly acknowledged the 10th reincarnation of Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, and an 8-year-old boy, a Mongolian boy, was introduced to the world. So what is the significance and implications of this development for Mongolia and the larger Buddhist community? Rinpoche already mentioned about the role of Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, not just in the Mongolian community, but also in the Tibetan community. But let's hear your perspective as well in this, and also about the spiritual figure's relation with the Dalai Lama in the Mongol-Tibet history. Dr. Bulag, the screen is yours.
Right. Thank you. Again, a fascinating question. Again, also a complicated one. Now, I think the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu institution or system and the Dalai Lama and the Panja Lama systems have notable differences. And even though, the Buddhist community and some in the academic community somehow think, that Jebtsundamba is the third in the hierarchy of the Tibetan Buddhism. But I somewhat have a different view. Now, we need to really clarify the relationship between the Jebtsundamba and the Dalai Lama systems. Now, let me give you a short history. That is, the reincarnation of the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu was established in the mid-17th century, half a century after the Khalkha, that the main group of the Mongols in the Republic of Mongolia today adopted Tibetan Buddhism. Now, this means that we should really recognize that the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu was a Khalkha Mongolian institution, right? Even though, of course, later on, Jebtsundamba Khutuktu became very influential, and he was adored by and worshipped by Mongols across the Mongol world. But at the very beginning, it was a Khalkha institution. And it's an institution with its first two reincarnations coming from the Khalkha princely families. And the whole sole purpose of that was to unify the Khalkha Mongols. Now, this Khalkha-ness of the institution, I think, put the Jebtsundamba system at odds with the Dalai Lama or the Pancha Lama institutions, right, whose claims were more universal or universalistic in nature, whereas the Jebtsundamba is more local, right? Now, we should remember also that Zanabazar, the first Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, was originally not a Gelugpa monk, in other words, belonging to the sect of the Dalai Lama or the Pancha Lama. But he was a reincarnation of the Jonong school, which was a different school from the Gelugpa. Now, of course, we know that the first Jebtsundamba Khutuktu was later recognized and also, right, that means that he was legitimated by the fifth Dalai Lama as a Gelugpa Lama. And the Khalkha princes overall complied with this. Even so, I think the Jebtsundamba institution remained distinct. They always have that Jonong thing, inside of them. And I think it is served as a Khalkha sovereign power, Khalkha, Mongol sovereign power in relation to the Dalai Lama or Tibetan system insisting or resisting subordination to his authority. Now, we all know, of course, as also mentioned earlier, that the Khalkha Buddhist sovereignty was really diminished around the mid-18th century when the second Jebtsundamba was suspected of supporting the Jungar, the Oirat rebellion against the Qing domination. So after his death, the Qing ensured that his reincarnations were found in Tibet, right, and confirmed by the Dalai Lama or the Pancha Lama, right. Now, despite this, subsequent Jebtsundambas, although they were all ethnically Tibetan, they were actually always adopted into the Khalkha royal family, and thereby, making them Khalkha or Mongol. So I think this contributed to the culmination of the eighth Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, albeit a Tibetan, right, being elevated by all to the throne as the Bogd Khan, that holy Khan of the newly revived Mongol state in 1911. Now, you asked me the question about the 10th Jebtsundamba being a Mongol, right? He was announced by the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in March early this year. Now, yes, that's true, but several things I think are involved here, especially from this announcement. That is, firstly, Jebtsundamba is an ethnic Mongol, right? Since the second, right? So between the second and the 10th, all Jebtsundambas were Tibetan. But again, this Mongol is the interesting Mongol because he was born in the States, in the United States, into a wealthy Khatka Mongol family. Now, I think, okay, well, this is complicated. Let me just skip it. I mean, I don't want to go into the complexity of the whole thing, but I believe this really paved the way for the revival of a Khatka-centered Mongolian Buddhism, or it has the potential to revive that tradition. And I think this development seems more aligned with a more national form of Buddhism rather than one claiming universality. So this is one thing. The second thing is that it is important to recognize that his predecessor, the ninth Panchen, Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, was Tibetan, and he was recognized by the 14th Dalai Lama, right? But his recognition occurred without consultation with the Mongols, right? So this really resulted in the fact that it took Mongolia a long time to accept him as the head of the Mongolian Buddhism. And even then, an intimate bond between him and the Mongols never really developed. So this is my second point. And the third point is that today there is a speculation, I think a very well speculation, that the Descendants Khutuktu now promoted as or recognized, or I think that many people want to see him as a third in the hierarchy of Tibetan Buddhism, Gelugpa Buddhism, could play a special role in the selection of the next Dalai Lama, or assume a more active international role, and given the current doubts about the Panchen Lama's legitimacy, right, and the newly established master-disciple relationship between the Dalai Lama and the new or young Jebtsundamba. So this development is new, and I think it warrants close attention. Now, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I would encourage a discussion about the diplomatic roles of Tibetan Buddhists and the implication for what you may call, or what you called, the larger Buddhist world, right? And because this larger Buddhist world is now an intensely politicized world, right? With China making nationalist claims of sovereignty over the Dalai Lama. So it's a complicated field and a very sensitive field, and I really encourage Mongolian constitutional scholars, experts, and even politicians to look into this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock. Your reflections have provided us a deeper understanding, and it has given a detailed information regarding Jebtsundamba Khutuktu and how this connection between the two spiritual figures remain vital even today. Thank you, Dr. Bullock. Moving on to our next question to Rinpoche. Rinpoche, please describe your role as the honorary representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Mongolia. The current Dalai Lama has visited Mongolia on 9 different occasions, with the last visit taking place on November 2016. So what is the current Mongolian government's policy towards the Dalai Lama, the Tibetans, and the Tibetan Buddhism? What efforts what efforts are you and your office making in strengthening ties between the Mongolian people and the Dalai Lama and Tibet? Tilu Rinpoche, the screen is yours.
Well, unlike the other 13 or so offices of Tibet that exist around the world, our Office of Tibet functions and responsibilities are slightly different as compared to the other offices of Tibet. The other officers of Tibet are more politically engaged, advocacy and lobbying for Tibet's issues and struggles. At the same time, our office is more promoting and strengthening and reviving the historical ties, mainly with the Mongolian ethnic groups. The office is based in Moscow. Now I am currently residing in Mongolia for the last 2.5 years. And out of the 13 countries that is under my jurisdiction, out of those 13 countries, Russia and Mongolia play the most important role in terms of establishing and strengthening our historical ties. So without a doubt, Mongolia and Russia is Tibet's longest foreign ally or friend, even before America, even before United Kingdom or any other European nation has established relations with Tibet. The Mongolians and through the Mongolian ethnic groups that are part of Russia have become Tibet's oldest allies historically. So therefore, in the 20th century, as I mentioned before, due to communism, we lost our historical ties. And the later part of the 20th century, we were able to reestablish, but unfortunately, we were reestablished this relationship during the time when the Tibetans were in exile. But nevertheless, many of the monastic institutions and culture centers, medical and astrological institutions were being reestablished in India. So that gave an open opportunity for many of the Mongolian ethnic groups to go to India to obtain their religious education after Mongolia became a democratic state. So therefore, our office has played a very important role in strengthening these deep historical, culture and religious ties that we have. The Mongolian government does not have a particular Tibet policy in written document other than knowing the status and situation of Tibet, but nevertheless, there's nothing that's written in document or officially that has been adapted. The only argument that China would give is that the one China policy that China usually demands every country to sign when they have certain agreements and treaties signed. But just like every other country, Mongolia has also signed the one China policy, recognition of one China. So Mongolia is also, another country who has also accepted and signed that document. That's how it's been, and I think that's how it will always remain. And the efforts that we make, is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is awareness and educating and informing the people of the current situation, and also what role that Mongolia can play as an independent nation. And again, unfortunately, in the Constitution, it clearly states that, church and state is separate. But nevertheless, Buddhism is part of our life. It's part of our culture. It's part of our existence. So there's really not very difficult for us to separate, Buddhism and Mongolian politics. It's something that is something that's mixed and inseparable. And when it comes to the issue of the reincarnation of the Jebtsundamba, it has not been an easy task. But nevertheless, finally, we were able to publicly announce, publicly recognize, and also just the last 2 weeks, Chado Rinpoche has been given the Kala Chakra empowerment here in Mongolia. And during the Kala Chakra initiation, the Jebtsundamba the reincarnation of the Jebtsundamba attended the teachings, and this is probably the first longest and major public event that he has appeared. And for him to be, he was recognized back in 2016, and here we are 2024. And you can imagine how many years it took for the Mongolians to be bold enough to be to be ready to face any critics or challenges from any external government, and to place him on in the proper place where he belongs. And of course, he's still young. I wish him the best, and it is my sincere and prayers for him to succeed, and not only in his modern education but also in his spiritual education as well. I mean, he is the symbol of our nation. He's a symbol of our history, and he is the symbol of our Mongolia's independence. And it's very important. And therefore, we are very thankful for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to guide us and assist us in recognizing and identifying the child. And just as Professor Bullock mentioned, Dr. Bullock mentioned that, if he grows up with the proper education, definitely he will most likely play an important role in the future recognition of the 15th Dalai Lama. We're not saying that he will be, but it all depends on his upbringing and the education that he receives. So we truly hope that we will be able to re-establish these historical ties, whether it's with the Dalai Lama, or whether it's with the Panchen Lama, or in general with the Tibetan people in general.
Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for explicitly walking us through the initiatives and efforts made by your office regarding strengthening the ties between the Mongolia and Tibet, and also talking more about Jebtsundamba Khutuktu. And and about mentioning that Buddhism is how Buddhism is important. It was actually the religion Buddhism which initially connected both the regions. And my next question is to Dr. Jadamba. Uh, like uh, like I mentioned, Buddhism is the main religion in Mongolia. However, the most recent national census conducted in 2020 states that only 59.4% of the individuals who are 15 and above identify as religious. So what are your thoughts on why over 40% of Mongolians don't subscribe to any organized religion? Where do you see Buddhism in Mongolia today? And especially after decades of religious repression under the Soviet Union, which wiped out almost all Buddhist clergy. Dr. Jadamba, let's hear your perspective.
Yes. According to the latest 2020 census, around 41% of Mongolians aged 15 and above don't follow any religion. This is partly due to the demographics of the Mongolian population. Mongolia is a relatively young country with a median age of around 27. So approximately 68% of people over 15 are between the ages of 15 and 30. Religious affiliation is less common in this age group. In contrast, the majority of religious believers are over 30 years old. So this suggests that religious identity plays a less significant role in the lives of younger Mongolians. And additionally, many Buddhist parents allow their children to choose their own faith. Among those who practice a religion, about 88% are Buddhists. So regarding this, the Buddhism in today's Mongolia. So Mongolia is uniquely positioned in the Buddhist world, especially in Vajrayana Buddhism. It is only democratic and sovereign state where Vajrayana Buddhism is the dominant tradition. So as we know, the Kingdom of Bhutan is another sovereign country where Vajrayana Buddhism is prevalent. So since the early 1990s, following the collapse of the social system, the Mongolian government has recognized Buddhism as an integral part of the country's cultural and traditional heritage. So this recognition is stated in key national legislations, including the Constitution of Mongolia, the law on between the state and monastery, and the concept of national security of Mongolia. So all of which acknowledge the dominant position and role of Buddhism in Mongolian society. So in my view, Mongolia can emerge as a center of Buddhist learning and culture if Buddhist leaders and followers actively pursue this vision. And furthermore, Mongolia could incorporate Buddhist diplomacy into its foreign policy, particularly within the framework of its third neighbor policy.
Thank you, Dr. Jebtsundamba, for your thoughtful analysis on the current state of Buddhism in Mongolia. And as we reflect on Buddhism in Mongolia, it's important to also consider the historical events that have shaped the spiritual and political ties between Mongolia and Tibet. One such pivotal moment was the exile of the 13th Dalai Lama in Mongolia from 1904 to 1906, a period that had profound implications for both regions. Dr. Bulag, in your work, you discuss the significant political impact of the 13th Dalai Lama's stay at Khalkha, if that's the right pronunciation, Khalkha, Mongolia during this time. So could you elaborate on how his presence influenced both Tibetan and Mongolian political landscapes and what this event reveals about the broader geopolitical dynamics in inner Asia during the early 20th century? Dr. Bulag.
Right. Thank you. I wrote, well, not really wrote, I compiled an archival documents, and together with Professor Accommodation Cho-yon, back in 2013, about the Dalai Lama's exiled in Mongolia from 1904 to 06. So I happen to know a little bit about his history of flight to Mongolia and the sort of a political consequence of his flight for both Tibet and for Mongolia. Now, I think his flight was really a very significant event, but it was not really an unprecedented one historically, because we know, centuries earlier, in the 1580s, right? Sonam Gyatso, if I pronounce the name correctly, Sonam Gyatso, in Mongolian, Sonam Gyatso, the Glukpa leader, right, sought refuge among the Mongols, forming an alliance that eventually led to the establishment of the title and institution of the Dalai Lama. But the certain Dalai Lamas exiled in Mongolia, I think, held a very different significance, and largely shaped by the political dynamics of the late Qing dynasty. That is the decline of the Mongol and Tibetan influence in the empire and the rise of the Chinese power in the empire. Now, I think we need to recognize that the Dalai Lama's destination, right? He was fleeing Tibet in the direction of north, but he was not really trying to get to Mongolia. His destination was Russia. Right? He hoped to gain support from Russia because he was influenced by, his teacher, a Burat Mongol monk, Dorjiev, and he was a Russian subject at that time. So he promoted this idea that the Russian Tsar was a white Khan and a new patron of Buddhism. And now that Qing dynasty was no longer interested in Tibetan Buddhism, so why don't you go to Russia where you have a new and very supportive patron? Right. So so he fled in that direction, but unfortunately for him, and Russia was embroiled in a war with Imperial Japan and lost the war. So the Russians were very reluctant to give him any substantial support. So therefore, he had to leave, and so he stayed there only 2 years. But his stay, or rather his flight from his homeland, driven away from the homeland. Well, not really driven away, but he decided to leave because of the young husband expedition and because the Qing dynasty was not really helping him. So he was very angry and he left. And his exile and his stay sojourn in Mongolia, right, really sent shock waves, I believe, through Mongolian leadership, particularly the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu. Because he was a very high-ranking Lama, right? Maybe just next to him, the Dalai Lama and the Pancha Lama. If we followed this newly sort of promoted idea that he was the third in the hierarchy, right? So if the number one figure in the Tibetan Buddhist world, and who used to be held with his theme in the Qing dynasty was dismissed and treated badly, then of course the third in the rank would have something to worry about, right? So it really became apparent to all the Mongols at that time, and including the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, that the Qing policies had fundamentally changed, right? And exemplified by their treatment or mistreatment of the Dalai Lama, who had to flee his homeland. And they came to an understanding that unless they severed the alliance with the Manchu, because of Manchu, the relationship between the Mongols and the Manchu were not really one, ruling the other, really, right? It was actually originally constituted as an alliance, right? Not as a ruler between a relationship between a ruler and a subject population. So unless the Mongols sever that relationship, that alliance, or dissolve that alliance, the Mongols would face domination and conquest by the Chinese, who were taking over the empire. So I would say, just keep it short, that the most immediate and profound consequence of the Dalai Lama's exile in Mongolia was really the Mongol declaration of independence from the Qing dynasty in December 1911. And that led to the establishment of the Mongolian state. And it is an empire come nation, right, with the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu elevated by all, or Urgusun in Mongolian, elevated by all to the position of Holy Khan, right, not president, right, the executive leader, but Holy Khan, Bogda Khan. Interestingly, he assumed the title of once held by or even at that time it was held by the Qing emperors. The Holy Khan, Bogd Khan, was the title of the Qing emperors. So he became the Holy Khan. So I would say that without the Dalai Lama's exile to Mongolia, there would be no Mongolian independence, or Mongolian independence would take a different trajectory, maybe, would be delayed. So that's my answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bulaq, for your exploration of the 13th Dalai Lama's exile in Mongolia and his far reaching political implications. I think this period marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between the two regions, laying the groundwork for future interactions and alliances. Now, my next question is for Telu Rinpoche. As a person of Kalmyk origin who received religious education in a Tibetan monastery in India, who lived amongst Tibetans and is now residing in Mongolia, like you said, for 2.5 years. You're very familiar with both Tibetan and Mongolian cultures. So, what is your perspective on how Tibetans view Mongolia and the Mongolian history? And why is it important for the Tibetans to understand and value the historical ties between Mongolians and Tibetans? And how can these ties be further strengthened? Rinpoche, over to you.
Yes. So even though I'm known and born and amongst a Kalmyk family, but nevertheless, I consider myself 100% pure Mongolian. My flesh and blood is Mongolian. Due to circumstances, our people became subjects of the Russian Empire, but nevertheless, our Mongolianism was never taken away from us. And that's one thing for us to understand and remember. I've been very fortunate to be born in America, and even more fortunate to grow up in India in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, to receive my religious education, and for the last 30 years to be serving the Kalmyk community in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now living in Mongolia for the last 2 years. It has made me much more wiser, experienced, and having that opportunity to live in different cultures and different mindsets. One thing I can say for sure is that the Mongolian and the Tibetans share so much in common, so much that's even beyond our imagination. It's not just food, and it's a way of life, the nomadic life, the mentality, the culture, the song, the instruments, the clothing. There's so much that we have influenced each other in the past many centuries that and just like His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, that Mongolians and Tibetans are like twin brothers and sisters, and it truly is. And even among the Mongolian language, there is many words that are Tibetan, and also in the Tibetan language, there's also many words that are also Mongolian as well, that many of them don't even realize or know. So I think I think the current state of both people, both of them experience the rule of communism, destruction of Buddhism, and the difficult period that both went through. There's a lot of similarities, and I think in modern day time we can definitely learn from each other in so many ways. Number one, I think the Tibetans, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, did a tremendous job in exile, preserving their identity, their culture, their tradition, and everything that have kept it intact. And that's something that Mongolia can learn from: preservation of culture, the spirit of not giving up. At the same time, I think the Tibetan people can learn from Mongolia. Why? Because Mongolia was a communist government for many decades, and we gained our we became a democratic state. And if the possibility is that Tibet becomes independent, which is still questionable and debatable, but nevertheless, even living in exile, being a democratic exile community, the rule of and the system of democratic values definitely can be learned from the Mongolian people. So I think there's a lot that we can share and learn from each other, and therefore I've been really promoting and working towards not only reestablishing these historical ties, but to better understand. I encourage I've taken a large number of groups of Mongolians to India in the last 2.5 years. And also, I encourage Tibetan scholars, writers, historians, and just general people to visit Mongolia to witness, the prosperity, our rich culture, our rich uniqueness, and also our history. There's a lot that the Tibetan people can learn from Mongolia as well, and that's something that's one lacking. There has already been over a few thousand Mongolians that have visited the Tibetan communities in exile, but there has been less than 200 Tibetans that have visited Mongolia in the last 30 years. That's my view.
Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for sharing your unique insights on how Tibetans perceive Mongolia and the significance of these historical ties. Your perspective has definitely underscored the deep cultural and spiritual connections that have existed between these two regions for centuries. And I definitely agree with you regarding like getting insights from Mongolia. Because they have gained democracy. Thank you so much, Rinpoche. Now, shifting our focus to the contemporary landscape, Dr. Jadamba, I'd like to delve into a topic that you've explored in your work. You've written about China's strategic use of Buddhist diplomacy, particularly through the donation of Maitreya Buddha statue as a means of expanding its influence in Mongolia and securing its national core interests, especially targeting Tibet and the Dalai Lama. Could you share your assessment of how effective this strategy has been in shaping public perception and political alignment in Mongolia? What do you see as the potential risk and benefits for Mongolia in engaging with this form of Chinese soft power, and how might it influence the long-term cultural and religious landscape in the region? Dr. Jadamba, the screen is yours.
Okay. So when we discuss Chinese religious soft power policy towards Buddhist countries in Asia, including Mongolia, so these questions arise. Is this policy effective in achieving its objectives? Does China successfully leverage religious soft power to advance its interests? So in Mongolia, Chinese religious soft power falls short in terms of creating genuine attraction and achieving its objectives without resorting to economic rewards or coercion. China often combines religious outreach with financial benefits or implicit threats of economic pressure on a country. So when its mudra of generosity fails to produce the desired outcomes, China swiftly shifts to the gesture of threatening. So this approach does not resonate with the Buddhist community, lacking sincerity and genuine commitment to promoting Buddhist values. So as a result, it struggles to build trust among Buddhists. So moreover, in Vajrayana Buddhism, devotion to one's guru is fundamental. So in this context, China lacks the legitimacy and authority of a guru, further undermining its religious soft power efforts. So lastly, I would like to cite the observation of the Chinese scholars. So in their 2015 paper titled Geo-Religion and Chinese Foreign Strategy, Fudan University professors Shu Yihua and Zhou Lei observed that, the quotation, horizontally, the golden bond of Buddhism connecting China, Japan, and South Korea, as well as the new silk connecting China and the Islamic world and Central Asia and the Middle East, displaying positive interaction. Vertically, Tibetan Buddhism can hardly promote Sino-Mongol relations. So this observation remains relevant today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jadamba, for your insights and for helping us understand about these influences. And drawing from your analysis, it also becomes important for Mongolia to carefully consider these influences to protect its cultural and its religious identity. Now, now, I now we have finished 2 rounds of individual questions. We have some time for the last general question, and I request our speakers to please keep it short. And the last question is really important because it talks about the independence of Tibet and Mongolia. During the 19th century, Tibet and Mongolia were caught up in the rivalry between British and Russian empires. And after the Qing dynasty ended in 1911, both regions took steps towards independence. Mongolia declared independence in December 1911, and Tibet followed in early 1913. They even signed a treaty of friendship and alliance on January 11th, 1913. Could you share your thoughts on the relationship between Tibet and Mongolia during this time, and why is it important? Finally, how do you think the succession and the reincarnation of the 14th Dalai Lama might impact the historical connection between Mongolia and Tibet? Let's start with Dr. Bulag.
Right. Thank you. It's a difficult, challenging question. Well, I think there is a fundamental difference between Tibetan independence from the Qing dynasty and the Tibetan independence from China, right? I think the key distinction lies really in the fact that the Qing dynasty and China were separate political entities, right? Now, during the Qing era, the Mongols were allies of the ruling Manchu, right? That needs to be remembered. So the Mongol declaration of independence before the Qing's collapse was essentially a dissolution of the alliance, right? I think I mentioned earlier also, and it was prompted by the Manchus or the sense of the Mongols that the Manchu betrayed them, and by aligning them with the Chinese interest for their own political survival. So that's Mongol independence, why they wanted to be independent from the Qing. But by 1913, the Qing dynasty had fallen, right? It was now China, right? And it had a nationalist ambition, right, to nationalize the whole territory of the empire. And it is sought to assert sovereignty over Tibet. Now, recently, I think a number of international legal scholars have argued that the 1913 Mongolian-Tibetan Treaty is a testimony to the independence of both Mongolia and Tibet from China. Now, while I respect this interpretation, let me offer a new perspective. That is, in my view, the treaty also signifies Mongolia's independence from an equal standing with Tibetan Buddhism, right? Tibetan Buddhism. Now, you may think, this is a preposterous claim, but to understand this claim, I think we really need to sort of revisit the certain Dalai Lama's visit to Mongolia, or his exile to Mongolia from 1904 to 6. Now, the relationship between the 13th Dalai Lama and the 8th Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, right, was far from cordial. This is because the Dalai Lama was aiming to establish an independent Buddhist state, right, universal Buddhist state with Russian support. And he saw himself as a supreme authority and treated the Jebtsundamba as a mere local subordinate leader. Right? Now, this attitude, the Dalai Lama's attitude, the certain Dalai Lama's attitude, right, ignore the proud Khalkha Mongolian tradition of their Buddhist sovereignty. So the Dalai Lama's sense of superiority over the Mongols was, this is also my claim, was really in large part, a result of the Qing dynasty's promotion of Tibet over Mongolia in religious matters for centuries and aimed at pacifying the Mongols, despite their supposed alliance between the Mongols and Manchu. Now, historians at that time and today, right? About 100 years ago and today, often criticize the Jebtsundamba for his indulgences, his bad habits, his superstitions, and his disrespect he showed to the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama was in Mongolia, right? That is, during his 2-year stay, the Jebtsundamba never actually went to meet or show his respect to the Dalai Lama. They didn't meet. Now, contemporary observers at that time, when they were in Mongolia, were really more impressed by the young, dynamic Dalai Lama, and they somewhat mistakenly believed that the Mongol princes would be more impressed as well and abandon the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu in favor of the Dalai Lama. But this never happened. Now, on my reading of the Mongolian archival materials, the Jebtsundamba and the Mongol Lamas together, collectively, resented the Dalai Lama's stay and for slighting the Mongol Buddhist and for the Tibetan monks' attempts to elevate the Dalai Lama's seat above that of the Jebtsundamba. So there was a lot of disputes, real disputes, right? And these disputes over ritual details and hosting protocols were not really trivial, right? They were, in fact, really struggles over jurisdictional authority. Ultimately, these struggles resulted in Mongol achieving equality with Tibetans in terms of religious authority, and an equality formally recognized in the 1913 Mongolian-Tibetan Treaty, where the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu and the Dalai Lama were acknowledged as sovereigns of two equal nations. And that's historical. Or historic, rather. So I think in short, I would say the Dalai Lama's exile in Mongolia led to two forms of Mongolian independence. That is the first independence from the Qing dynasty, right? And then Manchu domination. So that's political independence. But the second from Tibetan domination under the Dalai Lama, that's religious domination. Now, I very much hope, I mean, this is, of course, a historian's view, right, an academic view. I'm not very sensitive to all the, the complexities and, the politics, but this is an academic view. And I very much hope that the young Jebtsundamba Khutuktu will be able to study this history, right, about how Mongolian Buddhism, right, I'll emphatically say Mongolian Buddhism, developed as a distinct national Buddhism, right? Study this history, and really, as he grows up, to assume a more active, dynamic leadership role later. So that's my last word. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bulak. Rinpoche, let's hear your perspective on this.
My perspective, I want to touch upon the succession of the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama, if I may. What I see is the current recognition of the reincarnation of the 10th Bhakti Jebtsundamba is really a preparation stage or a testing stage for the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama. And the reason I say that is because if we compare the status, it is the Bhakti Jebtsundamba is equal as the Dalai Lama is for the Tibetan people. But nevertheless, here, as Dr. Bulak mentioned at the very, very beginning stage, it's a very complex and a very complicated topic. Now, we have to understand many factors, of course, to the time, limitations. We cannot elaborate all the details. But right now, the reincarnation is of Mongolian family. He was born in a Mongolian family, but he was born in America, which automatically gives him a U.S. citizenship. Number two is, because he was recognized as and identified by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2016, now there's the interest to have him brought up and educated in India. And this is where India comes into the picture of wanting the boy to study in India. At the same time, the U.S. government, and in particular the U.S. Congress, a few years ago, they have passed a law that is in relation to the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, where it clearly states that the future reincarnation of the Dalai Lama should only be decided by the Dalai Lama himself and the Tibetan people. Further on, it clearly mentions that the Chinese Communist government should not have any interference or should not have any say in that. And if so, the Chinese appointed Dalai Lama would not be recognized and would not be accepted by the U.S. government. So that's very clearly stated. At the same time, the boy and his family has been living in America since the beginning of this year, which had really rattled Mongolian politics because China has continuously bullied Mongolia's freedom of religion and our sovereignty in internal affairs by using the reincarnation of the Bhakti Jebtsundamba for their advantage. And I think the Mongolian government has not been able to wisely play this game and using the reincarnation in Mongolia's advantage. So therefore, there's a struggle right now. America wants the boy to grow up in America to see what China will do, what Mongolians will do and what the Indians would do. At the same time, the Indian people, also the Indian government, want the boy to grow up in India to see how China would react and how would Mongolia accept the consequences, and bullying by the China. And future more, what I call, and the reason I say this as a preparation stage of the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama is, by chance, if the future Dalai Lama is born in India, how should they handle it? So these, the 10th reincarnation is like an experiment for India, for America, and also for Mongolia and China and everyone. So unfortunately, it has turned out to be such a political, struggle, and wanting the boy everywhere. But at the same time, it's too early to come to any conclusions. But I personally do what I openly, tell everyone, that right now this is a testing ground, and preparation for the future reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, and that's how I see it.
Thank you so much, Telu Rinpoche. Finally, we have Dr. Jagdamba. Let's hear your perspective.
Okay. So regarding these the events which happened in the early 20th century, so I have no more comments on the Professor Bullock's Bullock said detailed remarks. And just adding one thing is the legacy of the 13th Dalai Lama is still remains in Mongolia. It's evident there is a couple of places in Mongolia is named by the connected, associated with the visit of the 13th Dalai Lama. For example, there is one spring, it's called the Dalai Lama Spring, something like that. And also one more thing is about these 13 Dalai Lamas exiled in Mongolia is, and also the why the Mongolia declared its independence from the Manchu Qing dynasty is one of the reasons that these alliance between Mongolia and Manchus collapsed. And also there's the ideology of this Buddhist empire, which which incorporates Tibet, Mongolia, and China, is collapsed. So this is one of the reasons why the Mongolia declared its independence. This is evident also in a letter sent by the 8th Jebtsundamba Khutuktu to the Russian Tsar. Okay, the second question about regarding this His Holiness Dalai Lama's reincarnation and also the involvement of the current 10th Jebtsundamba Khutuktu, it's very complex. It's very early to say what will happen. Maybe His Holiness Dalai Lama will be born in United States, or maybe in the family of Tibetan family. So both, this Dalai Lama and the Jebtsundamba Khutuktu have the U.S. citizenship, and also we know the acts they're passed through this U.S. Congress and approved by the Donald Trump as well as Joe Biden about two recent acts. So we don't know how this geopolitical play will go on between China, India, Tibet, and involving with Mongolia. We will see. It's very early to say, but in general, in terms of the Buddhist community of the Mongolian Buddhist community, so as for the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, it's important to emphasize that he's a deeply respected guru of Mongolian Buddhists. So his reincarnation will certainly strengthen the centuries-old spiritual bond between the Dalai Lama and the Mongols. So thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. And as we bring this enlightening discussion to close, I want to extend my gratitude to our distinguished panelists for sharing their deep insights and expertise. Today, we've journeyed through the rich historical ties between Mongolia and Tibet, explored the complex geopolitical influences, and reflected on the enduring spiritual connections that continue to shape both the regions. Your perspectives remind us uh, that your perspectives remind us of the importance of preserving these bonds for future generations. Thank you once again, dear speakers, and I would also like to thank our audience and everyone involved for this discussion. And before I end, I would like to say that the video of the session will be on AFI's X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram pages. So you can please follow them for more information on AFI's programs and activities. And we are also available both on Apple Podcast and YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.